Good morning. Almost got started on time today. That's my fault. Are there any announcements before we begin this morning? I don't know if anybody saw the Facebook post about Jacob Pace. He's the young man out in Colorado that's been battling cancer for about 2.5 years. There is a marker in your blood that helps monitor some cancer things, and it's called the beta HCG. And ever since Jacob was diagnosed with cancer some 2.5 years ago, it's been above 3. And after this last mass was removed, they did it, it was below a 1. And that's great. For a man that averages about a 2 under normal circumstances. So for Jacob to be near a 2 but below a 1 is phenomenal, which is good signs that things are progressing in the right way for him, but he's still got a long way to go. But that is great news that this marker that determines some cancers and things is well below a 1, and we're glad to hear that news. So God is answering prayers. Any other announcements? Yes, Tom. It's just not Florida that got hit, it's the whole stream. Well, we're thankful that those folks didn't get hit, but like you said, 20 minutes up the street. So there's a lot of devastation with flooding and winds and that. So let's definitely remember them in our prayers. Anything else? Will you bow with me, please? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning you've given us. Father, we're so grateful for the good news about Jacob. Father, we know this young man's got a long way to go and a lot more healing to do. We ask that you continue to be with him, strengthen him and heal him, Father, that he may become cancer-free. Father, we got a number of our family and friends who are struggling with illnesses, going through surgeries. You know each one's individual need. We ask that you extend your healing hand and restore their health. Father, there's been a lot of devastation through this storm, this hurricane that has come through Florida and up through the United States. Many people have been affected. Several have lost their lives, Father. We're grateful for the good news for those that run the Emmaus House in Tennessee, that they weren't affected by this. But up the road, there is devastation. We ask you to be with each of those and comfort them and allow us to do what we can to help them and help them get back on their feet. We're so grateful for everything you do for us, Father. We're grateful for Jesus and the sacrifice he made on our behalf. In his name, amen. Still in Daniel 11, but I want to back up a little bit to Mike Guest's sermon last week. And he touched on a few things that kind of relate to some of the things we talked about here in Daniel. And I can't remember the exact story that he gave, but there was a sign where he worked on the wall of having to do with, I think it was 12 things that were good for advertising or good for marketing, and 3 of them that he come up with that he could remember was fame, fortune, and power. And that's good for advertising, and he also related to how Satan uses these things in our lives today to help pull us away from God and get these things to become more prominent in our lives. If we take these things that Satan's using today on us, take it all the way back to the time with the wars that are going on between the southern and northern kings here back in Daniel, these kings are looking for the same thing. They're looking for power. They're looking for fame. They're looking for fortune. And we look back at what this angel, this person-like being that's talking to Daniel here saying, I couldn't come to you for 21 days because I was up against this prince of Persia. And eventually I got to leave and I got to go up against the prince of Greece. These are spiritual battles that are going on. So what we're seeing today of Satan trying to lure us away from God with fame, fortune, and power and things like that was happening 2,500 years ago. It was happening back to these kings back then. And Satan's using these things to corrupt these kings, these people in power, to get at God's people. So what we're seeing today in Satan happening in the spiritual realm in our lives is nothing new. It's been going on for thousands of years, and we can see it going all the way back to definitely of what this angel here was talking to Daniel about, and some of the kings, what Satan was trying to influence them to corrupt them and get them to eliminate the lineage that would eventually come through, which was Jesus Christ and his birth. So I think it was a great lesson that Mike did, and I just want to tie that in because it's like, that's exactly some of the things that we're talking about that's referring to back here in Daniel, of some of the things that Satan's using to try to influence us and get us to stay away from Jesus and to follow Satan. I just thought it was interesting with Mike's lesson like that. So, anything before we go on, because we're in Daniel chapter 11, we're going to be picking up with verse 14. Verses 14 through 19, Daniel chapter 11. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision. But they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege mound, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land, with destruction in his hand. He will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So he will turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he will stumble and be found no more. This angel still giving Daniel of what's going to be coming on. There's been happening this whole chapter here, and even part of chapter 10 of the vision that Daniel was having. And for the most part, we've been just the angels referred to the king of the north and the king of the south. No names are been mentioned. Everything I've been talking about of names, specific kings, has come through history of what historical records have shown us. And it's the same thing going on in verse 14 here. It's saying, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. He's not saying what specific king. As we've gone through many, many different kings as we're going through the Ptolemies and Seleucids of the king that's in power, and they're fighting, and the next king's in power. And it's the same thing that's going on here. But here in verse 14, when he's referring to the king of the south, this happens to be Ptolemy the Fifth. Here's where we're at now. We're at Ptolemy the Fifth, which is on the left side, which is the king of the south, which is Egypt. And he is now going up against Antiochus III. These are the two that are in power, these two kingdoms that are been doing the battling for the next little bit. But these are the two forces that are going on. And in verse 14, the king of the south is referring to Ptolemy the Fifth. And then verse 14 goes and say, it talks about many will rise up against the king. For the most part, I've been saying it's really just been the Seleucids and Ptolemies that have been fighting against each other. But there's others, little nations that are part of one or two of these sects here that battle against one of these nations. And going up against Ptolemy the Fifth, going up against Egypt and that, Philip of Macedonia went up against him, and Perdiccas, ruler of Chiliarchos, also went up against Ptolemy. So there's other nations that are going up against these kings as well. They're smaller, they're not as powerful, but they're going up against them. So we're seeing other nations starting to revolt, to resist some of the powers of Egypt at this time. And, Philip and Perdiccas are two of the ones that come up. So, but there's others that are happening here, and we see this in historical records of different kings and different nations rising up against the king of the south, which is Ptolemy the Fifth. And so not only is that going on, but in verse 14 we've gone, it says the violent ones. Some versions of the Bible says sons of robbers among your people. This is referring to some of the Jews. They've been kind of split at this point. Some are saying, I really don't like what's going on in Egypt, so I'm going to side with the Syrians. I'm going to side with the king of the north. And there's some that are saying, I really don't like what's going on up in Syria, so I'm going to side with the king of Egypt a little. I'm going to side with Ptolemy. So the Jews were divided a little bit here. And in verse 14, it's saying, among your people will lift themselves up. That's what it's talking about. Some of the Jewish people are going to be siding with Ptolemy the Fifth. Some of the Jewish people are going to be siding with Antiochus here. And they're not going to be fighting against each other, but they're supporting one of these rulers from either the king of the north or the king of the south. And we're talking about here, your people will lift themselves up, and it goes on, in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. The people that are supporting the king of the south here, they did that because they didn't like what was going on in the north. They didn't like what was happening in Syria. And it refers to here, this, but they will fall down. The battle happened. It didn't last very long. And the king of the south, Ptolemy V, he was defeated at this point. Not wiped out, not obliterated, but he lost his battle here. And he actually went up against an Egyptian general by the name of General, if I can find it here, General Skopas. He was the one that was fighting against the king of the north. And when he lost, he was actually punishing some of the Jews that were sided with the king of the north. He was not happy that they didn't side with him because he was the general of Egypt at the time. So he actually punished some of the Jews that sided with Antiochus. And that's saying some of these people that lifted themselves up, they will fall down. They fell down because the king that lost the battle was not happy that the Jewish people didn't support him. They actually resisted him and supported the king of the north. And he went and he punished some of these Jews that supported the king of the north versus his own troops at that point. And I skipped over the part in order to fulfill the vision. What vision are we talking about? There's been lots of visions in the book of Daniel here. And I don't think it's just this vision that Daniel's seeing here in chapter 10 going into chapter 11. I think it's the complete vision of what we're seeing in the entire book of Daniel. Because if we go back to Daniel 2, there was the vision of the statue, which is talking about the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, which is all parlaying into this. Then in Daniel chapter 7, the vision of the beast, which is the same group of people. But each time these visions are happening, a little more details given and a little more violence you can see is happening by these rulers that are taking place. Then the vision in Daniel chapter 8 about the ram and the goat is getting a little more specific between, who's going to be fighting here. And then in Daniel chapter 9, the vision of the 70 weeks. I think it's culmination of all these visions together is what it's talking about here in verse 14, that in order to fulfill the vision, not just the vision here that we're reading about in chapter 10 and 11, but I think it's a culmination of all these other visions, which is the same storyline, which is the Jews being in captivity, the Jews being persecuted because of what they did wrong, and there's going to be an end to this persecution at some point. God is going to bring an end to it. That's what I believe it's talking about in the reference to fulfill the vision in verse 14 here. And to fulfill the vision, which is something we really haven't gotten to yet, because there's more to this story here in the rest of chapter 11, because there's some 40 verses. We're not halfway through. But after verse 20, 22, or something like that, that's the meat of what this particular story is about here, about Antiochus IV, which we'll get to. He's the one that's going to cause the most grief, the most pain, the most suffering to the Jewish people. And when that's over, that is part of the fulfilling of the vision, which I believe is what's going to be happening here. Any comments on that? As we get into the next couple of verses, once we get into, I think it's roughly verse 21 or 22, we're going to stop seeing a lot of the phrase, the king of the south, the king of the north, because we're really going to be talking mainly about Antiochus IV when we get to him. And that's when the pronouns, he and him is going to be used a lot. So this angel that's talking to Daniel is not saying specifically who this person is, but he's no longer saying the king of the north or the king of the south. When he's referring to Antiochus, he is saying he and him, referring to the specific person of Antiochus IV. And when we get through that, the timeline will show us going back through history of this angel specifically referring to Antiochus IV. And like I said, verses 20 on to basically the end of the chapter, Antiochus IV is referred to he and him, not necessarily just a king at that point. A lot of information here in just these individual verses when we look at history and look at the timeline going back. And it's great that we have these records to put this all together and see the rest of the story versus some of the vagueness that the angel's telling Daniel here, but we can see the whole story and we know how it all plays out in the end. Going on that was just verse 14 of everything that's coming up, so we see the story that's going to be happening. And verse 15 is talking about the king of the north, which is Antiochus III, which is the guy that's in power right now. and he's battling. He's going to cast up a siege mound. Back in the day, they didn't have the jets and everything where they can bombard people from miles and miles away. This siege mound is the attacking forces would take a bunch of dirt and pile it up against the side of a fortified city, specifically their stone walls or brick walls, whatever it is. And they would put battering rams on there. They would use this as a ramp to get up over on the wall, but it's a way for them to attack well-fortified cities. So they'd build up this mound there, and it would do certain things. Once they started building mounds around, the attacking forces actually had the upper hand, preventing supplies from going in and out of the city. So when they did this, it would create a shortage of food, a shortage of water, which in turn hurt the people on the inside. They would start losing, you start losing your food supply, you start losing your water supply. You're going to become weaker, you're going to become fatigued because you don't have these supplies to maintain your strength. And that's one of the things that's happening here in verse 15, when the king of the north, Antiochus III, started attacking this well-fortified city. And this well-fortified city, when we go back through history, we see Antiochus is battling the Egyptians, which is in the south, and this specific city that he was battling, which history tells us was the city of Sidon. It was a well-fortified city at the time. It had been under attack. History tells us what happened. And the commander of the time of this city was General Scopas. He was an Egyptian general, and there was record of him battling Antiochus III. So we got Antiochus coming against this Egyptian city. There's these mounds of ramps going on where battering rams are going to against the wall. Everything that we're saying is happening in verse 15 happened. And the forces of the south, which is the Egyptian people, will not stand their ground. These people, after a period of time, they lost their strength because they had no water, they had no food. In turn, they weren't strong enough to maintain against the forces that were on the outside, and they did lose the battle. And General Scopas lost his battle at this point when he was attacked by Antiochus III, partially due to the shortage of food and water, the amount of the people that were battling him on the outside, and the people come distressed because they were weak, they were feeble, and they said, basically, this is the end of us, so we give up. And Antiochus III won this battle in Sidon against the Egyptian army at this point. And that's talking about everything that happened in verse 15 here. History says this is what happened, and here's the details of it. So the whole history we're seeing here in Daniel, we got historical records of what actually happened, of names and dates and things that really did happen. And it's a great thing to read the history of this. And I was amazed how much I learned by reading all this history, names and facts, that it actually lines up with word for word what's going in the Bible with names and dates.
Did you say Sidon, S-I-D-O-N?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any questions about that, or did you think it was something else?
I didn't hear you.
Oh, yes, it was Sidon, S-I-D-O-N. I'm sorry. And then going on to verse 16, he who comes against him will do as he pleases. Well, he who comes against Antiochus is coming against the general that was in the city of Sidon, and he's going to do as he's pleased, which he did once he overtook the town. And nobody was able to withstand him. This large army that was inside this well-fortified city lost. So Antiochus and his armies taking control of the city, and nobody was able to resist him at that point. And he will stay for a short time in the beautiful land. What do we know the beautiful land as? Palestine or Israel. And it's interesting, where are battles happening today over in the Middle East? In Palestine. I mean, it's been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and it still hasn't stopped. It's unbelievable. It's not the king of the north and king of the south again. Now it's a little more of the infighting going on there, but you don't see the big battles like we're seeing here in Daniel. But still, there's battle over this land with God's people in Palestine still today. It's unfortunate. So now Antiochus is, verse 14, 15, 16, he now has control of the Palestinian area, which could be a relief to the Jewish people because they've been under Ptolemy control for a while. But every time there's been a change of leadership, a change of government, change of rulers, things are changing for the Jewish people as well, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And eventually it's going to be worse for the Jewish people here, because coming through Antiochus III is going to be Antiochus IV, and he's going to be the one that's going to be putting a lot of grief for the Jewish people. When Antiochus III took over Sidon and eventually got into the Palestine area and overtook that, he didn't destroy Jerusalem like some of the kings would do. He didn't destroy it. He did loot it a little bit, but more importantly, he retaliated against the Jewish people that supported the Egyptian ruler. Just like what the Egyptian ruler, when he was attacked by the king, he retaliated against the Jewish people that supported Antiochus III. So being stuck in the middle between Syria and Egypt, if you chose a side, if your side lost, you got punished by the other guy. So it was a lose-lose situation for the Jewish people, no matter who they sided with. Eventually, they got punished by the guy from the other side. So we saw the Egyptian general punish the Jewish people because they didn't side with him. Now we're seeing the Jewish people who sided with Antiochus III from Syria punished because they sided with the Egyptian leader. And they were in a hard spot. They had no way to get out of this. They were stuck in the middle, and there's all this fighting going on. But the Jewish people did persevere, and they did get through this in the end, because we know what the end of the story is. At the end of verse 16, it talks about, that he'll stay for a short time. This is talking about Antiochus III, that he's going to stay a short time in Palestine. Even though he had destruction in his hand, even though he took the city, he didn't destroy the city, but he stayed for a short period of time. It's like, well, why would he stay for a short period of time? Well, he's ruler over Syria, so he's not just going to stay in one spot for a little bit. So Antiochus turned his attention to other things going on, to other concerns that he thought were more important, and his dominance in the area of over Syria and over the Israel area was unprecedented, and it was uncontested. People were leaving him alone at this point. So as Antiochus III had control here, he was left alone. There was no battles going on for a little while, except the Roman Empire, they were starting to ramp up. We haven't heard much about the Romans yet. They've been quiet. They're not in power yet, but they're starting to ramp up. And this could be one of the things that why they started to ramp up against some of the Greeks, against Antiochus, because Rome, to the west of this area, the northwest, they were starting to pose a threat. They were starting to become a powerhouse. And Rome had a very, very friendly relationship with the Egyptians. They had a vested interest in the grain export of Egypt to themselves. So when Antiochus III, the king of the north, king of Syria, attacked Egypt, that the Romans were very friendly with, that the Romans were getting their grain from, it piqued their interest, it got their ears open, they started to pay attention to what Antiochus III is starting to do, because now it's affecting them. The Romans aren't a powerhouse yet. They're starting to be. They're starting to be up and coming. But now the Greeks have the attentions of the Roman, and not in a good way. And we're going to see that a little bit more going on through some more of Daniel chapter 11 here. So Antiochus, by doing what he did, he's getting some unwelcome attention by the Romans, which he's going to have to pay for later on, because there's going to be a battle with him and some of the Roman army in a little bit here. Any questions? I mean, a lot of battles going on. We've pretty much stayed with the two rulers in charge, which is Ptolemy V and Antiochus III. They're still in power, but eventually there's going to be a changeover pretty soon. And but these are the rulers that are in charge, and these are the ones that we're going to be talking about for the next few minutes. And then, like I said, it's going to be changing when Cleopatra and she gets involved and whatnot, and Antiochus IV. Any questions? Comments? Let's move along. Verse 17, it talks about that he will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom. This is, talking about more fighting and wars, and the plan that Antiochus III has to get more and more control, to get more power, to get more fame, to get more fortune, which is something these rulers are all trying to get. And then he's trying to put a plan into effect that he can take over Egypt with as little bloodshed as possible, withdrawing as little tension as possible. So what does he do? Verse 17 says, he will also give him, meaning Ptolemy V, he will give him the daughter of women to ruin it. So Antiochus III is going to give his daughter to Ptolemy V, and hoping to ruin the plans that Ptolemy has, hoping to ruin Egypt, hoping to take control of Egypt. And but verse 17, we get the part of the end of the story, as Paul Harvey says, the rest of the story. She will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So we're going to see Antiochus III, his daughter there is Cleopatra. He gave her to marry Ptolemy V, and they did get married. And Antiochus didn't do this as a good gesture. He didn't do it thinking, oh, I want to make amends for this. I want to make sure that we don't fight anymore because he's got my daughter with him. No, he sent his daughter in there to be a spy, that she can convince Ptolemy V to change his ways, to listen to what Antiochus III, the king of the north, is saying, to get it so he can start taking control over Egypt. That's what his plan was. He was a smooth talker. He was eloquent in speech. He was trying to get things done in a backdoor fashion, so to speak, saying, if I can't beat you fighting you on the battlefield without a lot of bloodshed, let me give me a daughter. She'll work for me. She'll be on my side, and I'll get in the door a different way, and I'll start taking control. I'll have influence on Egypt in a different way. Well, that plan backfired. As we saw in verse 17, it's saying, but she won't take a stand for him. Cleopatra, she didn't do what? Yes, Tom?
I was just gonna say, I was doing some reading on this, and when he betrothed Cleopatra to Ptolemy V, he was 7 years old. He was only 7. So that, again, speaks to the idea that he's trying to influence the future of the Egyptian people. And so it said that the marriage wasn't even formally closed until 5 years later.
Until it became of age.
Now married to Cleopatra, and you begin to see the underhanded nature of Antiochus III. When he made this move, he was trying to grow the relationship through Cleopatra with Egypt.
I mean,
Yeah. It didn't say how old she was, but it said he was 7.
I didn't see the ages with what I looked at.
He was betrothed, and then, yeah, he married.
I mean, we saw how the marriage worked out earlier back up with Bernice and how that all turned out. And, I'm thinking what's going to happen with this one, but I didn't realize the ages that you were talking about there, and I didn't see anything for Cleopatra there. So this is all, Antiochus III is doing this to try to lay the groundwork to get influence for later on, which is amazing that this is happening. But, at the end of verse 17, she won't take a stand for him, meaning she won't take a stand for her father. She's staying faithful and loyal to her husband when it finally comes about, and she's going to do what he says. She's not trying to have an influence on him through her father. She's going to let her husband, Ptolemy, do what he wants to do. She's not going to have the influence from her father on that. She didn't take her father's side, and this, of course, made Dad mad. And it didn't help things when all that come about. So Cleopatra stuck with her husband. The plan backfired against Antiochus III. And then eventually when Cleopatra and Ptolemy had a son, which would be Ptolemy VI, he didn't side with his grandfather Antiochus III either. He stayed out of it. He stayed loyal to what his dad was wanting to have. And eventually Ptolemy V died, and Cleopatra, she became queen of Egypt. Now this is Cleopatra the first. Several weeks ago when we talked about it, Terry brought up, is this Cleopatra that we know with, Mark Antony and all that? That happens to be Cleopatra the seventh. Ptolemy V was the great-great-grandfather of the Cleopatra that we know. So it went from Ptolemy V to Ptolemy the VIII to Ptolemy the 11th to Ptolemy the 12th, which is Cleopatra's father. And I thought it would go from the 5th to the 6th to the 7th. No, the brother was named a 6 or a 7 or an 8, and so it's just not numerical order like that. But Ptolemy the 5th was Cleopatra that we know, Cleopatra the 7th of the Mark Antony. He was the great-great-grandfather of Cleopatra the 7th that we know with Mark Antony. So the lineage of the history of that still dates back to what we're seeing here is some of these rulers of the Ptolemies in the wartime era here. So with the Queen Cleopatra that really came in charge, it can relate back to this. So she's got her ancestry history that she can fall back on, and what some of these battles were, how they did, how these fought, who won, and the history of what her father, grandfather, great-great-grandfather all did against the Syrian army. Yes, Bill? A lot of them did. They might have been born with a different name and then took the name Cleopatra. Some of them were born and given the name Cleopatra. And there is a range of Cleopatra, second, third, fourth, that all go in there, that were sisters and cousins and all that. It's quite interesting when you follow it like that. So it's interesting but confusing. Yes, Jason? Yes. To kind of match what was there before them.
Who do you want to reference in ancestry?
Right.
Say you're as great as
That's what it is. I mean, we see it here. They're doing the same. A lot of these were born with it, but they're given the second name. I mean, Ptolemy Sot or Ptolemy, the second name is kind of what the distinction of these people are, but people are changing the name to follow the history, to follow the lineage of where they came from and the rulers of the either the Ptolemy area, the Seleucids, the Greek Empire. They follow that. The England, they're doing that stuff. So Caesar, yeah, that's another good one that we might get into a little bit. The same thing, they change their names for that. So apparently it's all in a name. Well, they're willing to change their name just to follow what's going on at that point. So any questions? These are great comments. I mean, people you guys picking up on this. I think it's great that you're bringing in the history to this, which is what I'm trying to do as well, versus just the glazing of it that, I don't know if glazing might not be the right word, but this angel's telling Daniel, he's not being specific. He's saying, here's what's going to happen, but we're seeing who's doing it, and we know what happened through history. Yes, Tom?
I'm just going to say, I fact checked myself. If you look, you get all kinds of different ages, but both of them were young.
Yeah.
Put that, like 27, 12.
You're within 3-5 years at that point. Yeah, I found that a lot. Some of the dates I put up there, well, this guy said it was 1 year different. Well, it's close enough for what we got. Back then, they didn't keep ages and dates as well as calendars we're doing now. Yeah.
Back then, bride and the groom didn't have anything to say about any of this.
No.
They were married when they had never met each other. And of course, they had no reason to like or dislike each other. They all knew that it was what was called today a political marriage.
Yes. I mean, that's what we have here. They were all political marriages. And there's still a lot of that going on today. It's just not brought to the forefront as much, but it's still happening today. It's not uncommon. And, it's how people are trying to gain that power, trying to get that rule to have influence in something that they've got no business having influence in. And that's what Antiochus is trying to do here. I mean, him giving his daughter was kind of like a proposal of peace. Here, let me give you my daughter. This is how much I think of you. I want you to have my daughter. No, I want you to take my daughter because I want her to influence you so I can get rule over your country. I mean, that's what it was. It was all political agenda at that point. Yes.
I knew older married couples in Japan that had not met each other until the day they got married. The marriage was completely arranged by their families, and neither one of the young people had anything to say about it. And generally, they were all minors when they got married.
Wow.
Sometimes better than others. Sometimes not.
We won't go down that road. Yeah. That's when you go, because mom and dad said, so. Well, yeah, all four.
Since he brought it up, the single most common theme in movies and books and television shows while I was in Japan was the eternal triangle. The man marries the woman because she's going to have the kids and take care of the house, but he finds romance with another woman. The triangle. That's what they call it, is the triangle.
Wow. I mean, I'm assuming that's not going back very far. I mean, we're not talking hundreds of years, but 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Yes. And I'm sure still, you touched base on this, probably still going on today, but nowhere near as prevalent. Go. Wait, no, he keeps bringing up people.
When you talk about marriage, the Fiddler on the Roof, there's a song in there, you know, the father, you know, it's all about traditions,
Right.
keeping the traditions, and things being questioned. So we love the movie. But in there, the husband, the father, and he looks at his wife and says, "Do you love me?" She says, "Do I what?" And he said, "You know, I cook 3 meals, I pack 3 kids, I take care of the house, I do this, and I do this." He goes, "But do you love me?" She keeps going on, you do all this stuff, and he said, "I guess I do love you." You know, and when we look at that, it's like, love is, you know, that's where love is in action. You know, that wasn't the emotional bond with them, that was a set-up marriage. And yet they made it work because they followed God's commandments. God says, do this, you know, put yourself, you know, put your spouse before yourself, and it works.
I heard a story similar to the Fiddler on the Roof, that a woman needs a man that will take care of her, needs a man that will provide for her, needs a man that makes sure she's got a nice home, she needs a man that will make sure she is healthy and well cared for, and she needs to make sure that these 4 men don't know each other. So, I mean, that's kind of like what we're seeing with the Japanese and some of this stuff. But, yeah, it was meant as a joke. But it's kind of true with some of these arranged marriages. I want a man that does this. One that does this, one that does this, one that does this. And there it is. As opposed to what we see as the traditional marriage, you know, the love and the relationship, that it's all in one with the one person. So, great comments about movies and other things. So, anything else referring to Daniel here as we keep going on? Now I know why I'm only getting through 4 verses a week. It's you guys. That's okay. We'll get through fine today. Ted's not here. Verse 18, unless there's any more comments on this. Verse 18, then he will turn his face, talking about Antiochus again, to the coastlands and capture many. So Antiochus III here saying, I'm meeting some resistance on land. I've got quite a bit what I want to do. Let me start, you know, hitting the water a little bit. So he's going up the coastline, you know, out in the Mediterranean Sea, and he's capturing these little towns here and there. He's doing a lot of fighting, and he's winning a lot of battles here. He's not losing because these are smaller places that he's starting to conquer. And eventually he sent a fleet of about 300 ships up, and he's starting, you know, in the Asia Minor area, and he's starting to go into Greece. And in particular, he started to go to the island of Rhodes. And the Rhodians weren't happy about this, so what they do? They appealed to Rome. Remember, a verse or two ago, Rome's not real happy with Antiochus because of what he was doing down to Egypt. So their ears are perked, and when the Rhodians say, hey, Antiochus is here, we're kind of looking for a little help. While all this was going on, and a little bit beforehand, there was this guy by the name of Hannibal. He was exiled by the Romans. He was a military advisor, and after being exiled by the Romans, he went and joined forces with Antiochus III. This, you know, pleased the Romans to know that the guy they exiled is joining forces with Antiochus III, who's going against Egypt, who's working on affecting their grain supply, who's now going up against the Rhodians up on the island of Rhodes. They're asking for help. So the Romans, what do you think they're going to do? Are they going to turn a blind eye? No. Now the Romans are going to start getting involved. And the Roman commander, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, he defeated Antiochus III in 190 through this battle here. And this is starting to be a turning point for Antiochus III. He's now starting to lose. And it happened to be this naval battle that did it. He won some naval wars, but now when he went up against this one island, and they appealed for help to the Romans, this is with a turning point, and Antiochus III was defeated at this point. And in the second half of verse 18, it says, but a commander, referring to the Roman commander Lucius, he will put a stop to this battle and to his scorn against him. Who's scorning? Who's this referring to? The scorn against him is Antiochus. And this is probably referring to the response that him and the Romans had an interaction with beforehand. Because he told the Romans that, hey, Asian's none of your business, so don't worry why I'm there. And he's saying to the Romans that you've got no right to ask what I'm doing up here, as I have as much right to say what you're doing in Italy. My business is none of your affairs. The Romans didn't see it that way. And Roman history is telling us through this that what happened was Antiochus was given an ultimatum to do something or not do something, and he eventually made the right choice. But Antiochus here at this battle with the Rhodians on the island of Rhodes, he did lose, and then a treaty was made at this point as well. The Treaty of Apamea, A-P-A-M-E-A, and this treaty said that Antiochus III had to repay Rome. Not the island he attacked, not the Rhodians that he attacked. He had to repay Rome. He had to surrender his elephants, some of his ships. He was fined 3,000 talents towards the expense of the war, and he had to pay 1,000 talents a year in taxes for the next 12 years. This is all because he went up against the Rhodians on the island of Rhodes, and they asked for the help from the Roman people. And this is by losing, this is part of his penalty. Along with this, Antiochus III's son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, was one of the ones taken hostage and taken back to Rome, and he stayed there for about 14 years. This is where history brings into play Antiochus IV. So he is now a captive by the Romans from the loss of this battle of Antiochus III. So the guy that's going to bring the most grief and hardship to the Jewish people is now in captivity, and he's going to be in Roman captivity for about 14 years. Verse 19, so he will turn his face, referring to Antiochus III. He's met his defeat. He's going to turn his face to the fortresses of his own land. He's retreating. He's going back to his own land. He's returning to Syria. He's later going to go to Mesopotamia. And it says, and he will stumble and fall and be found no more. So remember, he's got this 1,000 talents a year he's got to pay back in taxes for I think I said 12 years there. So his coffers are starting to run out of money. So he's got to do things to get money to pay the Romans. If you don't pay the Romans, not a good thing. And Rome is starting to become more and more powerful at this point. We talked about them, a few verses back that they're starting to come in. They're starting to flex their muscle. They did it here against Antiochus III on the island of Rhodes. So they're starting to become a powerhouse. So we're referring to Antiochus going back to his own fortresses and his own land. So he was actually looting and pillaging a temple of Bel in Persia. So he's stealing from his own people. He's stealing from the temple itself, and he was collecting this money that he's taken from this temple here. And this pillage of Bel in Persia was, Bel, B-E-L, was actually a Persian god that a temple was built to, a Babylonian god, way back in Nebuchadnezzar's day, where this name comes up. And he was actually taking this money so he could pay off the Romans. But the local people in that area weren't having anything to do with it. They resisted him coming in to loot the temple there. They actually managed to stop him from looting. They killed him, and this fulfills the prophecy of he will stumble. He was doing things. He wasn't able to complete it and will be found no more. So here is where the end of Antiochus III happens, when he was looting a temple of an old Babylonian god so he could pay off the Romans in the taxes of a war that he lost. So this is the end of Antiochus III. Roughly 185, 186, 187 BC is where he is now out of the picture. And next week we'll pick up in verse 20, and we're going to start talking about Antiochus IV and who else is going to be coming into play at that point. Any questions before we go? Thanks for being here.